All this after President Obama tried to explain Friday why this case has been so painful to blacks in his most extended discussion of race since entering the White House. Joining us now to continue that conversation, a rising conservative voice, noted pediatric surgeon Dr. Ben Carson, who's in Sun Valley, Idaho, and Democratic Congresswoman Donna Edwards of Maryland. So let's start with the president's remarks in which he talked about how he was profiled as a young black man, and then he said this.
If a white male teen was involved in the same kind of scenario, that from top to bottom, both the outcome and the aftermath might have been different.
Dr. Carson, some conservatives are criticizing the president for making this about race again. Do you agree?
Well, you know, what one has to recognize is that all of our opinions are based upon our lifetime experiences. And, you know, for instance, if you think somebody loves you, everything they say will be interpreted as loving. If you think somebody hates you, everything they say will be interpreted as hateful. And in a situation like this, I can certainly understand why there's such divergent views. And I understand why there's a lot of outrage. You have a situation where you have a young black male walking home, not doing anything incorrect, and he ends up killed, and nobody suffers any consequences. On the surface, that would appear to be a gross miscarriage of justice. However, one also has to integrate into that the fact that we have a legal system in which we appoint jurors, in which they have access to all of the facts. We don't have access to all of the facts, and in which they then make a judgment. It's not a perfect system, but it's the best system that we have. We have to decide whether we're willing to live with that or not.
Let me bring Congresswoman Edwards into this discussion. There was no evidence that in the FBI investigation beforehand or in the trial, no evidence that George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin because he was black. So was it constructive for the president to talk so much about race?
I think it was. I mean, I think when I talk to my son who's 24 and to his peers, what they say is that the president gave them their voice for their experiences. And, you know, as the president described, whether it's being followed around in a, you know, in a store or clutching bags in an elevator, those are experiences that my son, our sons have had, and it gave them that voice, and I thought it was really important for the president to validate and articulate that.
All right, let's go beyond rhetoric, because some civil rights leaders are now demanding that the Department of Justice either file hate crime a suit or civil rights violations against George Zimmerman. But it seemed to me the president, in his remarks, made it pretty clear. He said that people should have a clear expectation. That's not likely to happen. Does that disappoint you, Congresswoman Edwards?
Well, I think that both Attorney General Holder and the President have indicated the limitations of federal law. And although there is an open investigation, the Attorney General has said this, I actually have an expectation that it will be a thorough investigation, but there are limitations of federal law. It doesn't mean that there aren't things, as the President has said, that we shouldn't do, whether that is about law enforcement training, it's about people organizing to change state laws, and the things that we can do on a federal level to make sure that all of our young Trayvons have justice.
But if, after an investigation, Eric Holder, the Attorney General, says we can't bring federal action either on hate crime or civil rights violation, you'll accept that? I
think in the same way that people said that we wanted to make sure that there was justice in the justice system and that those charges be pursued in Florida. That happened, a jury verdict happened. We might be disappointed with it, but it did, and the same thing will be true of a Justice Department investigation. And I think, as you saw in the peaceful demonstrations, hundreds of them yesterday, it's really clear that people want not only want justice, but they want change.
Congresswoman Edwards, one more question. I'm going to bring Dr. Carson back into the conversation. Some of your colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus say that they are supporting the Reverend Jesse Jackson's call, or at least threat, of an economic boycott against Florida, which he calls an, quote, apartheid state for its passage of stand your ground laws. Do you support Jackson's rhetoric and his possible call for an economic boycott of Florida?
I actually haven't examined that, to be quite honest with you, and I think that, you know, many of us understand that sometimes when we call for those kind of economic boycotts, the impact on some of our communities could be really tremendous, and so I want to examine that first, and I don't think that there's been a unanimous call within the Congressional Black Caucus. In fact, we haven't even discussed that in the Congressional Black Caucus, to my knowledge.
Dr. Carson, it turns out that, in fact, in Florida, blacks have made 1/3 of the claims under Stand Your Ground in homicide cases. They were involved in double their representation in the population of Florida. On both that question of Stand Your Ground and also all the other demands that civil rights leaders are making about hate crime or civil rights violations, what do you think of those calls?
Well, you know, I think that we have a tendency to overemphasize superficial aspects of people. You know, I was asked once by an NPR reporter why I don't talk about race that often. And I said it's because I'm a neurosurgeon. And she looked at me quite quizzically. And I said, you see, when I take someone to the operating room and I peel down the scalp and take off the bone flap and open the dura, I'm operating on the thing that makes that person who they are. It's not the covering that makes them who they are. It's the brain who makes them who they are. And that's what Martin Luther King was talking about when he said, let's talk about the content of one's character rather than the superficial characteristics. We need to tone down this rhetoric. Those of us in leadership positions need to be looking for things that we can take out of this situation that will be helpful, not things that inflame the situation. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't look carefully at all of our laws. We shouldn't look carefully at this verdict and at this outcome. Make sure that everything has been done correctly, the I's have been dotted, the T's have been crossed. But let's tone down the rhetoric and recognize that we, the people, are not each other's enemies.
But Dr. Carson, I mean, really, to be clear, there are deep systemic problems that really impact African Americans in the system that have to be addressed, and I think the President spoke to some of those, and so we can't ignore that. And I mean, I'm going to acknowledge, just like anyone else, that everything is not about race, but there are some things that are, and we have to acknowledge those, and we have to make the systemic changes that are important to advance all of our communities so that people really can enjoy those things and the benefits, frankly, that Dr. Carson has enjoyed.
All right, but let's talk about another aspect of this, a systemic aspect of that. The President talked very briefly in his extended remarks about black-on-black crime, and as I looked into this, the numbers are just staggering. Let's put them up on the screen. African Americans make up 13% rather, of the population. But between 1976 and 2005, they committed more than half of all the murders in the U.S. And 93% of black murder victims are killed by blacks. Congresswoman Edwards, should the African American community be focusing on that, the black-on-black crime, the carnage in our inner cities, and not on George Zimmerman? Well,
let me tell you, to be clear, when we're focused on addressing issues of poverty, when we're focused on improving our education system, when we're focused on changing gun laws because there's such a rampant availability of guns in our inner cities, and we have no inner city agenda in this country, that's focusing on those statistics that you just talked about.
But when you have people demanding, let's go after George Zimmerman, let's hate crimes, economic boycotts of Florida, that isn't talking about the real problems in the inner city.
Well, I'm just going to say to you, because there have been some calls for those kind of actions, it doesn't mean we're not, sort of one-trick ponies. We're able to focus on a range of different things. And if you just look, even in this last 2 weeks in the Congress, the debate in the Congress has been about things like, do we provide for food and nutrition? Do we address issues of poverty? Are we going to make sure we have an education system that works for all of our young people so that they can succeed? And to the President's call, are we going to address the laws that actually contribute to the problems in our cities?
Let me bring Dr. Carson into this. I understand the concern with racial profiling, but is that the real threat to young black men?
I don't think it is. Obviously, I grew up in the inner city and had an opportunity to experience a lot of the problems that were there. And many of those problems are a result of the environment in which people grow up in and the philosophies that people develop. For instance, You know, in the inner city community, if it's late at night and you're walking along and somebody starts following you, you know, that's a serious issue. You know that immediately, and you go into a fight or flight mentality. That may not happen, you know, walking in a gated community in, you know, Palm Springs.
Dr.
So,
Carson,
you know, it depends
young
a lot.
men and my son and young men tell me all
excuse
the
me,
time
if I could finish, I would appreciate that. May I finish my comment and then?
Well, I just want to say, Dr. Carson, you really cannot ignore the fact that our young black men, in fact, are profiled. I have a young man who works for me. You know, he's a college graduate. 3 times in this last month, he's been stopped by law enforcement going to work.
Okay, let me give, because we're about to run out of time.
Chris.
Let's give Dr. Carson the final word. And I guess the key point is George Zimmerman a diversion from the real issue facing the real threat facing young African-American men?
Right. Now, what I was trying to get across is that when you grow up in that environment, you develop a different type of philosophy. And in fact, Trayvon Martin may well have had that philosophy and went into this fight or flight mode. So we can't necessarily say that he's evil or horrible, more so than anybody else when you grow up with that particular type of mentality. But again, I want to come back to what I was saying before. So often we take any kind of situation that occurs today in America and we get on the different sides of it and we hurl hand grenades at each other rather than engaging in intelligent discussion. This is what we need to do. Do we have a perfect system? Absolutely not. Does everybody think about things the right way? Absolutely not. But we're never going to get there if we continue to make ourselves into enemies.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Carson, Congresswoman Edwards, we hope we contributed to the conversation. Thank you both. Thanks for sharing part of your Sunday with us.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.